Hello and welcome to J Hutch Talks Too Much. I am your host. My name is Jesse. Tonight we are talking about Homer's Iliad, which is really the first major text in the Western canon, the earliest text in the Western canon, going back to roughly around 8 BC. Now, the last time I talked about a book, which was the first major episode that I did, I talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh, which goes back much farther than the Iliad does, and for many years was not necessarily as prominent of a text. It's become sort of more prominent over time. But the Iliad is sort of widely considered to be a foundational text. So I'm excited to talk about it tonight. First thing that I want to mention is I want to give credit to my daughter, who is around these parts is our resident expert in all things ancient Greece. And up to the last half hour, I was getting a lot of my information from her, confirming the names of certain gods and goddesses. So I certainly want to thank her for all the help that she gave me over the last couple of weeks in preparation for this discussion. The other thing that I do want to say, not that my full attention isn't devoted to this discussion on the text or to my audience who is either watching this or listening to this. But just as a point of confession, I do have the Blue Jays game going on in the background right now. And right now, as we speak, it's the third inning and the bases are loaded. But as I say, you have my absolute full attention. And if at any point I do start cheering or looking upset, it's mostly a response to the text. So always believe that, because that is the truth. All right. It is, however, still nevertheless September, and I only have so many loyalties in this life. Nevertheless, let's talk about Homer's Iliad. And actually, the first thing that I really want to do before getting started talking about the text itself is to, in fact, bring us back to the discussion that we had a few weeks ago when we talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh. One of the things that I mentioned about the Epic of Gilgamesh, and if you haven't watched that video yet on the Epic of Gilgamesh, it might be a good primer before talking about this one, because we are sort of going in at the moment, at least, in a kind of chronological order. I can't say for a fact that we're going to commit to that chronological order as we continue going on. But at the moment, that seems to be what we're doing. Again, the Epic of Gilgamesh, would have been some of the earliest versions of that text date back over 1,000 years before Homer's Iliad comes about. And the version I think that we looked at mostly kind of dates back maybe about 300 or so years before the text that we're looking at tonight. But we're still obviously in a very early period of literature. One of the things that I mentioned about the Epic of Gilgamesh is that for a long time that text was unknown to the Western world until it was sort of discovered archaeologically in the 19th century. However, I do firmly believe, based on this text, that Homer, or whoever wrote these texts, would have been aware of the Epic of Gilgamesh, because there are so many similarities. Now, one thing I do want to stress also is that I had not read Homer's Iliad until the last couple of weeks. So I'm reading this for the first time. This text is not certainly my area of expertise, but it is a text that fascinates me. I think that it's because it's such a foundational book, I think that it's an important one to read. And to go back to the very first video that I said about how the unpopular is important, It's not popular to read a text like the Iliad now. It would have been at one point, but it's not that popular now. But it is a foundational text in our world. And therefore, I think it's kind of important to read to find out what it is that it might be saying, what it might be saying about us, what might it have said about where we were going. Does it contain any information that is still valuable to us? So those are the questions that I had. But as I say, a lot of similarities to the Epic of Gilgamesh. So just as the Epic of Gilgamesh had a hero who was a demigod, so does the Iliad. The hero of the Iliad, in a manner of speaking, you could probably potentially argue between two people, but I'm going to suggest that the central hero of the Iliad is Achilles, the great warrior of the Achaeans, Greece's army at the time who were fighting the Trojans, as this is a story about the Trojan War in a way, or a specific moment from the Trojan War. Achilles is also a demigod, right? And also, just like Gilgamesh, his mother is a goddess, his father is immortal. Both characters in these stories have best friends who die, and that spurs them into a kind of an awakening and into action. And also there is a recognition on both the parts of Gilgamesh and Achilles, I think, that we have limited choices. And there's a question of, well, given our limited choices, how are we supposed to act? Now, there are a lot of differences between the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Iliad. The Epic of Gilgamesh, if you want to categorize it in a particular way, is much more of a spiritual journey of some kind, right? But the Iliad is more of a war story. So if you want to think of it in terms of like film genre, this falls more in line with movies like, Dunkirk or Platoon or Saving Private Ryan. A lot of intense sequences of battles in it, extremely violent battles. There is a tremendous amount of extreme violence in the Iliad. One wonders if, let's say, Homer was blamed in his day, rather misplaced blame on Homer for the violence in ancient Greek society. It's all because of the Iliad that people are going out there and fighting. But a lot of violence in the story. It is a lot of war scenes going on. I will say, I think the Iliad, at least for me, it's definitely worthwhile reading, and is probably, though, going to be more enjoyable to talk about than it was to read. But that, I will say, is true of most of the books that I have read. And I'm somebody who teaches literature. If you go back and look at the video that I did on self-directed education, for example, you'll see in that video I talk about how I'm not a particularly strong reader, and I've never considered myself a particularly strong reader. The act of actual reading, and maybe many of you can relate to this, the act of actual reading I find often to be difficult, to be work. I largely consider it to be hard work. And the fun of it, the reason why I got into studying literature, making it my profession, is that I really enjoyed talking about it, right? Much more so than reading it. And I find that that's true even of the best books that I've read, that it's even more fun to talk about them. And I'm sure many of you have had that experience too. You go out, you see a movie and you really like the movie, but then afterwards you chat about it with your friends and you say, what about that when that happened? And what about this when that happened? To me, that's the fun of it, right? That's the experience where it becomes a kind of enjoyable social experience. And I think that that's certainly going to be true in this particular case. One thing, too, I'll give you a little bit of context before getting into the story. So, as I say, this was written around 8th century BC, but it would have been telling a story that is set about 400 years before that, right? So it's looking back to a long time previous to the time that this story is being told. So it was being told in the actual poem is being written down in what's called the Archaic period of ancient Greece. It's coming right before the classical period that we often associate with ancient Greece. And it's after this period of what's referred to as the Greek Dark Ages. So to go through the sort of just quick time eras, you have the Bronze Age, then you have the Bronze Age collapse, which leads us into the Greek Dark Ages, which is followed by what's called the Archaic period. That's the period that Homer is writing in. And he's talking about a time period that would have been about 400 years earlier. Whether or not he's talking about the Trojan War, whether or not the Trojan War happened is a matter of sort of academic speculation, I think. I think whether it happened like the way it's being described in the text, I think is extraordinarily unlikely. But that's kind of the time period that we're talking about. And I think that that's significant. A lot of people, I listened to a few talks before this podcast, and a lot of people would say that, it would have been akin to a contemporary British audience seeing a play or reading about, medieval knights or something like that. And there's a significance in that, right? Those sorts of stories have a way of unifying, or at least creating the impression of a unified identity, right? This is who we are, right? If we go back and look at our old sort of stories, our foundational texts, we will find out something about ourselves. And I think that it's quite interesting that after a period of collapse, that Homer should write a story about honor and glory and warriors. And I think that there is a kind of sense of, I don't want to say make ancient Greece great again, but I do think that there is an element of that at work here in this text. Like this, remember that this is how things once were, right? And he's not looking at it strictly through rose-colored glasses, because the depiction of war that he's showing us is so awful at times. And I don't think we're meant to say, wow, this is amazing, let's do that. I think in many ways, when even in the audience at the time would have said, whoa, this is a little too much gore for me. So it's not necessarily fully romanticizing the past. It's acknowledging some of the problems that are at work. But I do think that there is this kind of sense of, look at this greatness. That is who we are as well. So that's the context for this. It would have been most likely told as an oral narrative before it was written down in the 8th century. The story, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, would have been circulating for quite a long time. But it's written down in the 8th century BC, and that's the version that we have. The version that I was looking at for this video was, oddly enough, a sort of Roman translation of it. It was translated by this guy, Samuel Butler. All the gods and goddesses' names were the Roman gods and goddesses. So instead of, so I got to read a lot of by Jove, which was pretty exciting. A lot of people say by Jove in the text, and that's pretty awesome. But of course they're referring to, in the original text, it would have been a reference to Zeus. So I don't know why it got translated into the Roman gods and goddesses, but it nevertheless did. One of the things that's also, I think, significant about the Iliad is that it's about the Trojan War, or at least it's taking place during the Trojan War. It's not about the war in its entirety, right? So a lot of the things that we come to associate with the Trojan War, like, for example, the way that it ends with the Trojan horse, are not in this text, right? What we're looking at, in fact, is a very small episode from the Trojan War. And I have read that, when the Iliad would have been performed, somebody would have stood up on a stage and recited, which is crazy when you look at how long the text is, recited the Iliad. It would have been part of a larger sort of piece, which probably would have told the story of the Trojan War in its entirety. So we don't get the end of the war. We also don't get the beginning of the war. This is told years into the Trojan War, very close to the end of the Trojan War. They battled for, I think, 9 or 10 years, roughly, in that space. So they've done a lot of fighting by the time that we start reading the Iliad. So, and I like the fact that it does that. I have to say, I like that aspect of it, and it makes me think a little bit of I've had the experience of seeing a lot of music bios over the years, docu bio, rocku dramas. I don't know what you call them, but I've seen like Walk the Line, Ray, those kinds of movies. I've seen a lot of those movies. And it seems to me that their flaw is to tell the entire story of this person's life in 2 hours. And it never holds together, or really, in my opinion, it doesn't hold my interest because it's not saying anything. It's just sort of going over. You can only explore the most superficial moments in somebody's life, or not the most superficial moments, but the key moments in the most superficial ways, because you only have like 4 minutes to spend on this moment before you move on to another moment. So obviously, I think the better music bios are ones that tend to focus on a very specific moment in somebody's life, rather than try to look at the entire history of a person and to sum it up within 2 hours. Well, the Iliad does that. It makes that choice. It is not attempting to talk about the entire Trojan War. And obviously, as we move forward ahead to the 19th century in terms of literature, you get even larger descriptions of war, like in Tolstoy's War and Peace, where he's talking about, even then he's just talking about part of a war, the War of 1812. And but that's a book that's over 1,000 pages long. The Iliad, the description of war, also did remind me of another one of my favorite novels, Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, because in that book, if you've read that, he part 2, I believe it's part 2, also deviates from its story in order to tell the story of Battle of Waterloo for hundreds of pages. So I think that this kind of sets off a particular kind of genre in writing. But as I say, it's just a very particular moment. And I think that that's a good choice because we get to explore these very human moments within the war, right? It's not just like this moment happened and then this moment happened and then this moment happened and then this moment happened. Rather, there were some very specific human elements at work in this war. And that because you had flawed humans making decisions, that those would have these sort of enormous consequences. And you get to really explore those flaws, those moments, and the consequences that they had. And I think that is in part why it was such a strong decision, I think, to just focus on this one particular element of it. Nevertheless, I think to really understand the text, it's good to have a bit of the context for it. So I do want to give just a little bit of context in order to explain what's going on within the Iliad. So, as I say, it's a story of the Trojan War. Now, maybe many of you know what the Trojan War is, how it began, but I'll just give a very quick little primer that explains how the Trojan War begins. So it starts off with a kind of a very Sleeping Beauty-esque scenario. You have this wedding between Thetis and Peleus, who happen to be Achilles' parents eventually. So you have Thetis marrying Peleus. You have a goddess named Eris who is not invited to the wedding. This sounds familiar, I'm sure. And she's irate about this. And so she decides to mix things up a little bit, to try and get everybody all enraged. And guess what? She sure does, because she basically sets off the entire Trojan War, which lasts a decade. So she takes this apple and she throws it into the wedding, and it says something along the lines of "to the fairest of them all." So there's three goddesses then at that point who think, oh, well, it must be about me. And it's that those three goddesses are Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. So they're all like fighting over the apple, which must be very complicated because apples are pretty small. So I don't really know exactly how they're all fighting over this thing, but they're fighting over it. And they ask Zeus to say, which one of us is this apple intended for? Who is the fairest of them all? Zeus says, nope, I'm not getting involved in this one. And he turns it over to this guy Paris. So Paris, who is a Trojan, is asked to name who is the fairest of them all. And all three goddesses try to entice Paris to name him. They bribe him with power, with wisdom. And Aphrodite says, if you say that it's me, I'll let you marry the most beautiful woman in the world, not just the fairest goddess of them all, but the most beautiful woman in the world. This sounds good to Paris. More than power, more than wisdom. What good are any of those things? He decides, okay, that sounds good. It's Aphrodite. And so then she says, all right, well, you can have the most beautiful woman in the world. What does the most beautiful woman in the world think of this? That part does not come up. And that's, I will acknowledge right from the get-go, is very problematic and in line with a lot of things that are at work in this story. Anyway, that most beautiful woman in the world is Helen. Now, Helen is then taken to Troy by Paris, at which point Menelaus is upset. Now, why is that? Well, he was married to Helen. In fact, he is still married to Helen. And so, he's like, well, that's my wife. And I'm not crazy about this whole, absconding business. I'm not a fan of the absconding. Although Menelaus, I'm sure, has absconded on many occasions, but he doesn't like this particular kind of absconding when it's his wife. So, this basically sets off the Trojan War, because now the Achaeans, the Greeks, make it their duty to go and get her back. And so they start, trashing Ilios. That's where the title comes from, which is otherwise known as Troy. So they start, ransacking it. And then we get to, so that's what kicks it off. Now we're 9 or 10 years into the war. And that's essentially when the Iliad starts. And I'll just read you the first line of the book. Sing, O goddess, the anger of Achilles, son of Peleus, that brought countless ills upon the Achaeans. Okay, so we get this first line. By the way, many people will translate that word anger as rage. So they'll say that really the first line is about rage. But either way, rage, anger, that's what this story is ostensibly about, is Achilles' anger or rage. Achilles is fighting in the war. He's one of the greatest warriors if not the greatest, perhaps the greatest warrior that the Greeks have in this fight. And so why is he so upset? Well, what happens is that part of where the what the warriors are doing in order to show that they are victorious is that they end up taking prizes. Now, quite often, many of those prizes are women. Yes, that is a problem. But that was how it was expressed in this text, that the prizes that they were taking were women. Now, Agamemnon, who is the leader of the Achaean army, has taken this one particular woman as a prize. Her name is Chryses, something along those lines. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing the name, but her name is Chryses. Now, a priest comes to Agamemnon and says, Chryses is my daughter, and you need to return her to me. At which point Agamemnon says, no, I'm not going to return Chryses to you. And so the priest leaves, and a plague besets the Achaean army. At which point, it goes on for, I think, 9 or 10 days. It devastates the Achaean army, and of course motivates Agamemnon to return Chryses to her father and end the plague, because after all, there is a war to win, and the Achaean army is being devastated by this plague, and they're not going to be able to win the war and if there's this plague that's going on. So Agamemnon says, all right, that's fine. I will return Chryses to the priest. Achilles, give me your prize, also a woman, and we'll call the whole thing fair. At which point Achilles says, what? You're going to do what? And Agamemnon says, oh, well, I'm going to take your prize as my own, because I can't, now I'm without a prize. What am I supposed to do with myself? I don't have a prize. Look at me. I'm the leader of the military. I need a prize here. I look ridiculous. And which is actually quite true, because as one writer pointed out, again, I will acknowledge that this is a problem, but possession of women was important to a man's standing and honor. Paris's theft of Helen, for example, which started the war, struck a huge blow to the honor of Menelaus and became the initial cause of the war between the Greeks and the Trojans, right? And so in many ways, this moment where Agamemnon has to give up Chryses is another blow to his honor. And again, he's the leader of the Achaean army, right? He cannot look weak in front of them. So he has this kind of moment where he says, okay, in order to appear strong in the eyes of the army, I have to take the prize of the best warrior. And Achilles at this point kind of recognizes that there's not really much that he could do. By the way, his prize is named Briseis, which is almost identical to Chryses. And so he says, all right, that's fine. Well, he doesn't really say that's fine, but he says, I'll give her to you. And then he goes off and he leaves the war. He says, all right, I'm not taking part of this anymore. I don't want to have anything to do with you, Agamemnon, or any of this. And he goes off, and he's pissed. He's not happy about what's going on. So he goes off, and he summons his mother, Thetis, who you'll recall was a goddess. And he says, look, I've been humiliated here. I need you to go and ask Zeus to basically thwart the war effort for the Achaeans, help the Trojans, so that Agamemnon and the Achaeans could see just how important I am to them, and then they'll feel bad for what they did. It's kind of like, when the idea of like a kid will run away from home or something like that, and then say, now my parents will know because they'll be worried sick about me. By the way, not a bad strategy, not a good strategy. But nevertheless, this is also not a great strategy either, what Achilles is doing. So Thetis then does go to Zeus, and Zeus says, all right, I will now help the Trojans win the war. And the rest of the next, 15, 16 chapters of this book have the Trojans destroying the Achaean army with the help of the greatest god of them all, Mr. Zeus. When you're that big, they call you Mr., just to go back to an old commercial reference from the 90s. And that's exactly what happens, right? So Zeus ends up helping the Trojans. The Trojans, occasionally there's some pushback. Trojans are being led by this guy named Hector. Hector, you'll recall before I said that, that Achilles is probably the hero of the story, but if there's another hero of the story, it's Hector, right? Hector. The thing is that I think that this text does so brilliantly is that it's not a good versus evil fight. It's not the good Achaeans versus the bad Trojans, or vice versa. There's not many bad people in this, but Hector is in many ways a very praiseworthy character throughout the Iliad. So, you have Achilles as your potential hero, but you also have Hector, who is, by the standards of the text, a very noble kind of character. And he leads the Trojans to fight back in a very vicious and effective way against the Achaeans. Now, one of the things that I do want to talk about before really getting into what I think is going on within this story is that and actually this is, as far as I can tell, this is a very underplayed or under-discussed aspect of the text. It's not to say that it's never discussed. It is discussed a little bit. But one aspect of the text that I think could maybe deserve a bit more attention is the role that the gods and the goddesses play in the story. A lot of attention is focused on Achilles and Hector and Agamemnon, but there's a lot of space in the Iliad that is devoted to the gods and the goddesses, who essentially take sides in this story. Obviously, Hera and Athena are very much on the sides of the Achaeans. And I say that that's obvious because you'll remember that Paris did not choose them years earlier as the fairest of them all. I don't know if that's the exact reason why they are so pro-Achaean in this dogfight, but nevertheless, I think it's maybe not a coincidence that they are. And then, of course, Aphrodite, who Paris did pick, is on the side of the Trojans, as is Zeus, once Thetis comes to basically ask Zeus to help support the Trojans. So, you have often the gods and the goddesses squaring off against each other, helping each side win. And Zeus will occasionally say, you guys have got to back off. And then, like, behind his back, he's like basically helping the Trojans kill another 1,000 people or something like that. So, and then he's like, well, I'm not doing it. Don't worry about that. But please stop helping the Achaeans. It's not the right thing to do. We've got to meddle. We can't keep meddling in people's affairs. So something along those lines, but yeah, so there's a lot of meddling that's going on. Just to give sort of a few sort of quotes as a way of maybe explaining the sort of roles that the gods are playing within the Iliad. One moment you see this is a direct quote, Diomed hurled his spear, and Minerva, who is Athena, Athena guided it on to Pandarus's nose near the eye. It went crashing in among his white teeth. The bronze point cut through the roof of his cut through the root of his tongue. I don't think that that's right. Coming out under his chin, and his glistening armor rang, rattling round him as he fell heavily to the ground. Well, I told you that the book was violent, but there is an example of Athena, a goddess, guiding a spear to kill Pandarus. Now, later on in the book, you have this character named Patroclus, who is really Achilles' best friend. At one point, Patroclus implores Achilles to return to the battle. Achilles says no. So Patroclus says, all right, well, give me your armor and I will fight as you, and the Trojans will think that I am you, and they're so afraid of you that I can take advantage of that and slay a whole bunch of Trojans, which he is successful in doing for a while. And then Hector. So spoilers, I'm going to reveal everything that happens in this story. Hector ends up killing him, kills Patroclus. And these are Patroclus's final words. He says, Hector, vaunt as you will, for Zeus and Apollo have vouchsafed you victory. It is they, Zeus and Apollo, who have vanquished me so easily, and they who have stripped the armor from my shoulders. Had 20 such men as you attacked me, all of them would have fallen before my spear. Fate and the son of Leto have overpowered me, and among mortal men. So I wanted to focus on these two quotes because the question arises a little bit like, would an audience have actually believed that there was an actual Zeus, that there was an actual Athena that was guiding the spear towards the guy's nose? I think the main point to consider here is that, as many people will often say, the gods were created in order to make sense of the world, the natural world, right? In absence of a solid explanation for why things happened, they created the Greek gods as these sort of explanations, right? And I think that in many ways, that's sort of the role that they perform within this text, right? You can imagine the Iliad as if these gods were not necessarily real, but were nevertheless personifications of explanations of why things were happening. Why am I being killed right now by Hector? I'm Patroclus. I'm great. Why should I be killed? And he says, it's not you, Hector, that's doing it. I'm way better than you, Hector. It must be because Zeus and Apollo have vouchsafed you victories. So it's an explanation for things, for why things happen the way they happen. But also the role of the gods demonstrate how much of life is dictated by forces outside of your control. That could mean the gods, right? It could mean that there's some master plan out there who are planning things out, and therefore I have no control over things. But it could also mean just general hardships, right? It could mean living the life of immense poverty where you have very little control over your actions. I wish I could do this. I wish I could do that. I wish I could do these things. But because of my station in life, I can't do those things, right? So that's different from fate, but it is similarly your life being dictated by forces that are outside of your control. It could mean war, right? It could mean having to go and fight in a war, right? As we talked about when we talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh a few weeks ago, life was deeply unsatisfying for so many people at that time. Maybe still to this day, but it was deeply unsatisfying When you look at how, hard people had to toil and how they had none of the luxuries that any of us take for granted today. And the only way that you could really justify that to yourself, or maybe make yourself feel better about that, is to accept. This is when we were talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh. That accept that there's a plan for everything, right? You're just part of some sort of master plan. Well, I think similarly in this text, you have the gods as representing the same sort of thing, that there are so many things in life that are outside of your control. Achilles himself is a victim of more powerful forces than he, right? So, for example, before the war begins, he is told that he basically has two options, that he has sort of two potential fates. One fate is that he will live a very long life and die an old man, but he has to stay at home. The other option is that he will fight in the Trojan War and gain all sorts of what's called glory, and we'll talk about glory in just a minute, but he will get the glories of having fought in this war, this as being an incredible war hero, but he will die young. Now, one could certainly say there, Achilles has a choice. It's not like they're just saying, this is what you have to do, but that's still a very limited choice. What if Achilles wants to fight in the war and get glory, but also live until the age of 90? Well, that's not an option for him, right? So, his choices are limited. He's not entirely without choice, but his choices are limited. And then as the story begins, right, he is a victim of powerful forces beyond his control, right? Agamemnon says, give me your prize. He has to give Agamemnon his prize because Agamemnon outranks him. What is he going to do? Right? Well, what he does is he basically goes off and he does nothing. He retreats into inaction. He goes off and sits. Now, he does get Thetis, his mother, to sway the war in the favor of the Trojans, so that the Achaeans become so desperate that they need Achilles to fight. But nevertheless, like the majority of the book, as I say, Achilles is the hero, and he's doing nothing. It reminds me a lot of, there's this Simpsons episode where I think it's the one where Marge starts making pretzels, and there ends up. It's been a long time since I've seen the episode, so I can't remember exactly what happens in it. But at one point, closer to the end, like there's this mob war that starts as a result of Marge's pretzel making, and the Yakuza show up at some point, and they are trying to shuffle the family. Marge, I think, is trying to shuffle the family inside as this war between the mafia and the Yakuza is going on the front lawn, and Homer says, wait a minute, though. That guy in the white suit, he's just been standing there the whole time. He hasn't done anything yet. And I know when he is going to do something, it's going to be incredible. So I want to stay here and watch it. She's like, no. You have to go in. And they close the door, and it cuts to the credits. And you just hear something crazy go on. So obviously the guy in the white suit sprung into action. That's kind of the feeling that you have in this text about Achilles. Like, right from the start, like, sing, O goddesses, the rage of Achilles. This is not going to be just the story of a guy who goes off and sits on the sidelines for the entire book. But it does go on for a long time, chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter. Achilles is still not in it. They first send a couple envoys. Go get Achilles. He probably wants to fight for us now. Nope. It sends him away. Even his best friend Patroclus comes along and says, Achilles, maybe you'd like to do this. Nope, I wouldn't. So Patroclus takes the armor and he goes off to fight. So yeah, I mean, he's retreating largely into inaction, but in the end, he does act, right? He decides to spring into action. So this doesn't mean that Achilles, the lesson here of the story is ultimately you need to accept what the powerful are telling you to accept, right? That's not the message, I don't think, anyways, of the Iliad. It's not saying, look, regardless of what happens, we're always a victim of fate, right? We're always going to be at the behest of powerful forces beyond our control. So you might as well just do what those powerful forces are telling you. I don't think that that's what's going on in this story. Achilles does not act because Agamemnon wants him to, right? When he comes back, Agamemnon says, oh, by the way, we'll give you a whole bunch of these prizes. You can have your prizes back now, because they've been so devastated by Achilles going away that they've decided, okay, you can have your prizes back now. Again, they don't consult Briseis about this at all, but nevertheless, Achilles responds by saying this. This is a quote: "It is not well to tarry talking about trifles, for there is a deed which is as yet to do." Right? This is the trifles that he's referring to are what have set this entire story in motion from the beginning, right? And now he's just dismissing them as kind of irrelevant. I'm not doing this for the trifles. And it's essentially, I think, kind of code for, I'm not doing this for you. Don't, Agamemnon, don't mistake me returning to this war because I've thought, you know what, ultimately you're a good guy. You're asking me to do this. I'm going to do this for you. That is not what Achilles is doing here in this story. So he's returning to the fight, I think, because what he is discovering is that, or what he has discovered, is that ultimately there are values that are important and that he wants to reaffirm those values. So what are the values, right? Rather than just sitting back and doing nothing, right? What are the values that this text are suggesting is important? Well, a big one is glory. Okay, so we talked a little bit about glory. So what is glory? Why glory? Well, one writer, Muhammad Ishtiaq, writes, honor and glory were at the core of Greek civilization in Homer's time, as the Greeks recognized that honor and glory last far longer than any physical remnants of a person's life, right? To go back to the discussion of the Epic of Gilgamesh, life was pretty difficult, but it was also quite short. And one of the things that this text is positing is that given that life is so short, we need to sort of embrace the things that go beyond just mortal life. And if you have honor, if you have glory, then you have gone beyond just mere mortality, right? That will last long. People will continue to remember you. And it is in some ways like achieving a kind of immortality to some degree. Now, we've already talked about the importance of honor, right? Honor, Agamemnon feels dishonored, especially feels dishonored in the eyes of his military men. And then Achilles feels dishonored, right, by Agamemnon. Menelaus feels dishonored. What about glory? Well, Ishtiaq goes on to say that characters gain glory, in the Iliad at least, characters gain glory through their performances and bravery in battle. There's actually a kind of, if you've ever watched any Star Trek in your day, there's a real Klingon element here at work in both the Achaeans and the Trojans in this story, right? Meaning that I think it is a key value of the text itself, right? The Klingon values of honor and glory. The Klingons will say, today is a good day to die or something like that. And they're always talking about what is the thing to do that will bring us honor. And so, that if you want to think about sort of the mindset of this text, you can think Klingon to some degree, right? Honor and glory. And that glory comes through, your performance and bravery in battle. It's a good thing to go out and fight. Ishtiak goes on to say, Hector and other Trojans, for example, scorn Paris for backing down from Menelaus, right? Paris is a very, again, in the eyes of the text, is a very sort of weak character. They always have to cajole Paris to come and join the fight. Like they're pushing him basically into battle, and he's always kind of like retreating. But Hector, on the other hand, is incredibly brave, and that's why he is in many ways a noble character. Again, given the mindset of the text. Ishtiak goes on to say, Achilles also acquires glory by deferring the option of a long, peaceful life, as we talked about was one of his options, in order to fight and become an epic hero, right? So this idea of achieving some kind of glory is an important value, right? So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what Agamemnon believes, what he says, what he wants. It happens to be that Achilles is doing the thing that Agamemnon wants him to do, which is joining the fight and joining the battle. But he's not doing it for Agamemnon. He's not doing it because there's a greater power telling him to do it. He's doing it for this value that he values, which is glory. But more important, maybe not more important than glory, but along with glory is things like comradeship and solidarity and a kind of brotherhood to some degree. If we go back to the very first sort of episode of this story, when the priest comes to Agamemnon and says, I would like to have my daughter back. You need to return my daughter, or else I will set a plague upon you. And Agamemnon says, no. I think we're meant to read this negatively. We're meant to read Agamemnon negatively. In fact, when I read this text, Agamemnon strikes me as being one of the most unlikable characters in the story. And I don't think we're really supposed to like him all that much. I think we're supposed to, in some ways, despite all the issues that we quite understandably have about this passing around of women who don't have any agency in this world, despite that, I do think that we take Achilles' side more than Agamemnon, because Agamemnon is only thinking about himself. He's not thinking about the people that he leads, right? That this plague is going to destroy them. He's not thinking about his people either when he takes Achilles' prize, right? Because, when Achilles walks off, he knows that this is I'm sure this is his greatest warrior. This is going to be devastating for him, right? But it's more important for him. And that's where this kind of issue of honor becomes tricky, because there is a kind of honor at work. And Agamemnon is trying to act to save his honor in that moment. But we're not on his side, because there's other values that are competing with honor. And that is camaraderie and solidarity. And so when Achilles acts, what spurs him into action is that his best friend has been killed by Hector. That's the thing that spurs him into action, right? It's that his best friend was murdered, and they still have his body, and he doesn't like what's going on, and he's going in there for his friend, right? And so there is this kind of value of solidarity that is at work in Achilles that is also quite noble, and that also makes him quite distinct in the text. So yes, glory is important. Yes, honor is important, but there are other important values within this text, and one of them is comradeship and solidarity. But there's more than just this too, because this is not the end of the book. The book does not end with Achilles going and killing Hector, right? Which he does. Okay, he does kill Hector very close to the end of the text, and then they go and have these festival games, which is a really bizarre chapter. The penultimate, second last chapter of the book are these odd and unusual games that are being set up as a celebration. But that's not the end of the story. At the end of the story, we get Priam, who is Hector's father, who we see throughout the story. And he comes to Achilles in this really emotional scene. He is devastated by the loss of his son, Hector. And he wants Hector's dead body returned to him so that he can have a decent burial for Hector and so that the Trojans can mourn for Hector. So this moment is reiterating a central component of the story, which is the question of, will you give me back this person, right? If you think about it, this happens frequently. This is what the whole story turns on, is this question, right? The war, the Trojan War, which, again, I should say, we don't find out too much about. But if you are looking at the story of the Iliad at the time, you would be familiar with the story of the Trojan War. And that war centers on that question of, will you give me back this person? It centers on Menelaus wanting to get Helen back from Paris, and Paris won't give her up. And so this continues the war year after year after year. Then we have the actual book itself starting with this question. The priest who comes to Agamemnon and says, will you give me back my daughter? And Agamemnon says no. And then a plague starts, and then you get day after day after day of illness and violence. And then he does decide to give her up, but it's with a condition, right? It's a conditional moment, right? He says at that point, okay, I will give her up, but I'm going to take Briseis from Achilles, right? And that decision, that conditional response, brings on massive bloodshed, right? And then Patroclus gets killed, and they have the Trojans have his body. They are keeping his body. They're trying to get it back. They can't get it back. There's all this sort of bloodshed being fought over that. And then finally you get to this moment that happens at the very end of the text, where Priam, Hector's father, comes to Achilles and once again asks this question that has been asked over and over and over again. Will you give me back this person? Will you give me back my son so that I can mourn for him? And Achilles, there is a lot of dialogue, but Achilles simply says at the end, yes. And that's really the end of the story. That Priam is able to bring his son back home, and Troy can mourn for Achilles. Now, does this moment where Achilles gives Hector over to Hector's father, does it end the war? No. The war continues on after this story, but intriguingly, we don't see it continue. The story ends with this moment. Does it save Achilles' life? No. He's still fated to die in this war. This one sort of moment, this one choice that he's making, ultimately doesn't change that much. But in the eyes of Priam, it changes a whole lot, because he's able to give his son a decent funeral, a respectful funeral. And it's not earth-shattering. It doesn't change things in a momentous way, but it's emotionally significant for this one person, right? Yes, there are still so many things outside of the individual's control, right? Achilles could very well say, you know what? I've come back to fight in this war. I'm going to die. Whatever I do at this point, I just don't care. I'll just keep fighting. I'm keeping your son. I don't care, because no matter what I do, I'm going to die, right? But he doesn't say that. He says yes to Priam, right? The beginning of this story shows us Achilles' rage, But the end of the story shows him his compassion and his love, right? His capacity for compassion and love. And I think that is what makes the Iliad very significant, right? It's telling us, yeah, there's lots of things that are beyond our control, beyond our power, but we can do these little things that are actually quite meaningful for people and can help them in some way. Now, I think that there is a fair criticism that one could make about this text, right? Beyond the horrible gender politics at work in the story, right? One could say, all right, but the book is still not calling for an end to the sort of institutions that put us at the mercy of others, right? It's saying, okay, it's taking kind of war is inevitable stance. Power is inevitable. Hierarchies are inevitable. And within that inevitability, we can make good choices. It's kind of the Ted Lasso approach to politics, if I may critique a current hit TV show. And you know what? I think that that's a fair criticism, but much more fair in a more democratic society where you have more control over what's happening to you. In a society where you have much less power, it's difficult, much more difficult to make those kind of arguments. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be made, but it's a more difficult argument to make. So I think that that's a fair criticism to make, but I do think that certainly within this time period, when people's options and choices were so severely limited, and we could say that they are describing those limited choices in terms of the way that they construct the gods in this story as deciding so much of what happens, that within that kind of world where you have such curtailed options, that you can make these choices that don't change things in a significant way, but are nevertheless extraordinarily meaningful. Very similar to the Epic of Gilgamesh, but the way it's portrayed is quite different. The type of story that it tells is quite different, and I think it's a bit of a twist on the narrative that we talked about. But thank you for listening to my discussion on the Iliad. I think the next week I'm going to, or not next week, but the next text that I'll be looking at will be, it's not part 2 necessarily, and I've in fact heard some scholars suggest that it's quite possible that the person who wrote the Odyssey is not even the same person who wrote the Iliad. But I'll leave that discussion up to people who are more expert on the topic of ancient Greek culture. But they do kind of go hand in hand. I didn't talk about Odysseus, who is a character in the Iliad. Obviously not an extraordinarily central character, but he's there quite a bit. But since they are so connected, those two stories, I think that it would be worthwhile talking about the two of them together. So those are my thoughts. Thank you so much. If you like this video, please feel free to hit the like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet to J Hutch Talks Too Much, please feel free to subscribe. It's been a pleasure talking about this again, and I hope to see you in the next one. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.